She isn't moving. Call for a doctor, quickly.
Oh, Margaret. Speak to me.
Could an innocent boy really be accused of murder? Welcome to Unsolved Mystery Vault. I'm your moderator, Falcon. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. I love hearing your thoughts. Let's uncover this puzzling case together. Chapter 1: The Quiet Afternoon at Rosebank Cottage. St. Weatherby-on-Hill was, by all accounts, the sort of village where nothing particularly dreadful ever happened. Nestled among gently sloping green fields and bordered by ancient hedgerows, the village seemed frozen in a pleasant and predictable rhythm. The church bell chimed at the proper hours, the postman followed the same route every morning, and every resident knew exactly who preferred raspberry jam over strawberry at the village shop. It was the kind of place where secrets, if they existed at all, wore very polite smiles. On this particular afternoon, the sun rested warmly over Rosebank Cottage, a charming little house with pale yellow walls and a garden overflowing with lavender, daisies, and climbing roses. Bees hummed lazily through the air while a faint breeze stirred the curtains inside the sitting room. At the small tea table near the window sat Miss Jane Marple. Miss Marple, who had long since become an expert in the quiet art of observing people, stirred her tea thoughtfully. Her knitting needles clicked together with soft precision as a length of pale blue wool slowly transformed into what would undoubtedly become a perfectly respectable scarf. Across from her sat Mrs. Eliza Cartwright, who was speaking with great enthusiasm while helping herself to a second slice of lemon cake. "I'm telling you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Cartwright said with an emphatic nod, "young Oliver Hastings has always been a strange boy. Very strange indeed." Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Really?" she said gently. "In what way?" Mrs. Cartwright leaned forward conspiratorially, though there was no one else in the room to overhear. "Well, he keeps to himself, for one thing. Hardly speaks to anyone. Always lurking about with that serious expression of his. And then there's his aunt, of course." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Aunt Margaret?" Yes, Miss Margaret Hastings," Mrs. Cartwright replied. "Quite wealthy, you know. Owns half the land near the East Meadow. Never married. Very strict woman. Keeps everything precisely in order." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I remember. A very determined lady." Mrs. Cartwright lowered her voice. "Determined is one word for it. Some people say she's downright cruel with that boy." Miss Marple did not immediately reply. Her knitting needles continued their soft, rhythmic clicking. Outside, the peaceful hum of the afternoon continued without interruption. Then suddenly, the front garden gate slammed open. Footsteps rushed along the gravel path. Before anyone inside could react, the cottage door burst open and in stumbled Mrs. Porter, the baker's wife, breathless and pale as a sheet. "Miss Marple." "Mrs. Cartwright," she gasped. Mrs. Cartwright nearly dropped her teacup. "Good heavens, Martha. What is it?" Mrs. Porter clutched the doorframe as though the very floor might give way beneath her. There's been something terrible." Miss Marple calmly set her knitting aside. "What has happened, Mrs. Porter?" Mrs. Porter swallowed hard. "At Rosewood Manor. Miss Margaret Hastings, she's been found dead." The words seemed to hang in the warm afternoon air like an unexpected thunderclap. Mrs. Cartwright gasped loudly. "Dead?" "Yes," Mrs. Porter whispered. "Murdered." For a brief moment, even the bees outside seemed to fall silent. Miss Marple's expression did not change dramatically, but her eyes sharpened ever so slightly. "Murdered, you say?" Mrs. Porter nodded frantically. "The police are already there. Inspector Bellamy from Market Ford came straight away." "And her nephew?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Porter hesitated. "That's the worst part." Mrs. Cartwright gripped the edge of the table. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Porter lowered her voice to a trembling whisper. "They've arrested Oliver Hastings." Mrs. Cartwright let out a cry of disbelief. "The boy?" "Yes," Mrs. Porter said. "They say he was found inside the house, standing right beside her body." The sitting room grew very still. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "And how old is Oliver now?" she asked softly. 17, Mrs. Porter replied. Mrs. Cartwright shook her head furiously. "I knew it. There was always something unsettling about that boy." Miss Marple did not immediately respond. Instead, she reached calmly for her teacup and took a small sip. Then she said, almost absently, 17 is a curious age." Mrs. Cartwright blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Well, my dear Mrs. Cartwright, people often imagine that wickedness appears suddenly and dramatically. But in my experience, human nature rarely works in such a straightforward manner." Mrs. Porter stared anxiously. "You don't think he did it?" Miss Marple looked out the window toward the quiet village lane. Children were still playing in the distance. A cart rolled slowly past. Life, as always, appeared perfectly normal. But Miss Marple's mind had already begun its quiet, careful work. "You see," she said thoughtfully, picking up her knitting once more, "a young person accused of something dreadful is rather like a loose thread in a piece of knitting." Her needles clicked again. "One must be very careful before pulling it." Mrs. Cartwright frowned. "I don't quite understand." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Oh, it's quite simple really." She paused. "And I suspect," she added gently, "that this particular thread may lead somewhere quite unexpected." Outside, the church bell began to ring the hour. In St. Weatherby-on-Hill, the peaceful afternoon had just become something far more dangerous. And though the police believed the case already solved, Miss Marple, quietly knitting beside the window, was not so certain. The mystery had only just begun.
"I've come back."
We were worried.
As you should be.
Chapter 2, The Village Begins to Whisper. News traveled through St. Weatherby-on-Hill with remarkable speed, though no one in the village would ever admit to encouraging gossip. By early evening, however, every doorstep, shop counter, and garden gate seemed to buzz with the same shocking conversation. Margaret Hastings was dead. And her own nephew had been arrested for the crime. At the village grocer's shop, Mrs. Cartwright repeated the news with great authority to anyone willing to listen. "I heard it directly from Mrs. Porter," she declared while clutching her basket of apples. "The boy was standing right beside the body when the police arrived. If that isn't suspicious, I don't know what is." Across the counter, Mr. Pritchard, the grocer, raised an eyebrow. "Still," he said thoughtfully, "Oliver's a quiet lad. Never caused trouble." Mrs. Cartwright sniffed. "Quiet people are often the most dangerous." At the nearby butcher's stall, Mr. Green had his own opinion. "Money," he said firmly while trimming a cut of beef. "Always money. The boy stands to inherit everything, doesn't he?" A small crowd nodded gravely. Inheritance had long been considered the most reliable explanation for dreadful family matters. Meanwhile, the village postman, Mr. Fletcher, carried the news from house to house with a seriousness usually reserved for official telegrams. Each retelling added a slight variation. Some said Oliver had argued with his aunt the night before. Others insisted neighbors had heard shouting from Rosewood Manor earlier that afternoon. By sunset, the story had grown far more dramatic than the facts could possibly support. But the village was certain of one thing. The case was practically solved. Only one person in St. Weatherby-on-Hill seemed notably unconvinced. Miss Marple spent the early evening exactly as she always did, sitting by the window of Rosebank Cottage, knitting calmly while the fading sunlight stretched across the garden. To anyone passing by, she looked like a harmless elderly lady enjoying a quiet evening. But Miss Marple's mind was very busy. Human nature, she often reflected, was remarkably consistent. People behaved in predictable patterns, much like the familiar personalities one encountered in a small village. And over the years she had discovered something quite interesting. The simplest explanation was very often the wrong one. A gentle knock sounded at the cottage door. Miss Marple looked up. "Come in." Mrs. Porter entered again, this time accompanied by a tall, rather serious-looking man wearing a dark overcoat. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Porter said quickly, "this is Inspector Bellamy. He's come from Market Ford to handle the investigation." Inspector Bellamy removed his hat politely. "Miss Marple, I've heard you're something of a local authority on village matters." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh dear, nothing quite so impressive, Inspector. I simply notice things." Inspector Bellamy gave a polite but skeptical nod. "Yes, well. I'm trying to understand the family situation between Mrs. Hastings and her nephew." Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "Please sit down." The inspector did so, though with the faint air of a man humoring a harmless curiosity. Mrs. Porter remained standing near the door, clearly eager to hear every word. Inspector Bellamy opened a small notebook. "You knew Mrs. Hastings?" Casually, Miss Marple replied. "Though one does hear things in a village." "And the boy, Oliver?" Miss Marple considered carefully. "A very reserved young man. Thoughtful, I would say." Inspector Bellamy scribbled something. "Reserved young men sometimes hide unpleasant tempers." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "That is certainly possible." The inspector leaned forward slightly. There were no signs of forced entry at the house. Mrs. Hastings was struck once with a heavy object, most likely the brass fire poker found nearby. Mrs. Porter gasped quietly. Inspector Bellamy continued. "The boy claims he discovered the body when he returned from the garden. But unfortunately for him, he flipped a page in his notebook. His fingerprints are on the poker." Mrs. Porter whispered, "Oh my." Miss Marple did not react dramatically. "Did he explain that?" "Yes," said the inspector with a dry tone. "He says he picked it up after finding the body." Miss Marple nodded slowly. A very natural reaction for a frightened young person. Inspector Bellamy gave a faint shrug. "Perhaps. But there's more." He looked directly at her. "The boy argued with his aunt this afternoon. Loudly enough for the maid to hear." Mrs. Porter's eyes widened. "An argument about what?" "Money," the inspector replied. Mrs. Hastings apparently intended to send him away to a boarding school immediately. Miss Marple paused her knitting. "Immediately?" "Yes." Inspector Bellamy tapped his notebook. "And according to the housemaid, Oliver shouted something quite memorable before storming out." Mrs. Porter leaned forward eagerly. "What did he say?" Inspector Bellamy spoke the words slowly. "He said, 'I wish you were dead.'" The room fell silent. Mrs. Porter looked horrified. "Well, that settles it, doesn't it?" Inspector Bellamy closed his notebook. "It certainly doesn't help the boy's case." Miss Marple resumed knitting, her expression thoughtful. "Yes," she murmured softly. Inspector Bellamy stood and placed his hat back on his head. "The evidence is fairly clear. But procedure requires a thorough investigation." He gave Miss Marple a courteous nod. "Thank you for your time." After he left, Mrs. Porter exhaled loudly. "Well, I never imagined such wickedness from that boy." Miss Marple did not immediately respond. Her knitting needles moved steadily again. Finally she said quietly. "People say dreadful things in anger, Mrs. Porter." "Yes, but wishing someone dead." Miss Marple looked out toward the darkening village road. "I have known perfectly respectable people who have said the very same thing, she said gently. Mrs. Porter frowned. You don't think he meant it? Miss Marple's voice remained calm. Oh, he may very well have meant it. She paused. But meaning something, and doing it. Her needles clicked again. Are quite different matters. Outside, night settled over St. Weatherby-on-Hill. And somewhere inside the police station in Market Ford, a frightened 17-year-old boy sat alone in a cell. While the entire village believed the mystery was solved, Miss Marple was only just beginning to notice the threads that did not belong. Chapter 3: A Quiet Listener. The following morning in St. Weatherby-on-Hill arrived with the same gentle calm it always had. Sunlight crept slowly across the rooftops, birds chirped from the hedgerows, and the baker's shop filled with the comforting smell of warm bread. To any visitor passing through, the village appeared perfectly peaceful. Yet beneath that calm surface, the previous day's terrible news continued to ripple through every conversation. Miss Marple, as usual, began her morning with tea by the window at Rosebank Cottage. The small table beside her held a neatly folded newspaper from Market Ford, though she had only glanced briefly at the front page. The headline was already predictable. Local boy held in aunt's murder. Miss Marple had seen similar headlines before in her life. They were rarely as simple as they seemed. Her knitting lay neatly in her lap, though she had not yet begun working on it. Instead, she was thinking. Thinking, most particularly, about something Inspector Bellamy had said the evening before. Mrs. Hastings had planned to send Oliver away immediately. It was, Miss Marple reflected, an unusually sudden decision. A knock sounded at the door just as she reached for her knitting needles. It was Mrs. Cartwright again, breathless with excitement and carrying a fresh basket of gossip. "My dear Miss Marple," she announced as she entered, "the entire village is talking about nothing else." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, I imagine they are." Mrs. Cartwright settled into the chair opposite her without invitation. "Well, I've just come from the grocer's. Apparently the police questioned the housemaid this morning." "Oh?" Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes. A girl named Lucy Bennet. Very nervous, they say. But she confirmed everything." Miss Marple began knitting slowly. "What exactly did she confirm?" Mrs. Cartwright leaned forward. "The argument. It was quite dreadful, apparently. She heard Oliver shouting at his aunt in the sitting room." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Hastings?" "Oh, she was furious. Lucy says she told the boy he was ungrateful and that she had made a terrible mistake taking him in." Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. "I see." Mrs. Cartwright lowered her voice. "And then Oliver said those awful words about wishing she were dead." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Inspector Bellamy mentioned that." "But that's not all," Mrs. Cartwright added eagerly. Miss Marple looked up. "There's more?" "Oh yes. Lucy also said Oliver stormed out into the garden afterward. And when she later went to fetch Mrs. Hastings for tea." She paused dramatically. "She found the body." Miss Marple's knitting slowed. "And Oliver?" "Standing right there beside her." Miss Marple did not immediately speak. Instead, she finished a careful row of stitches before placing the knitting neatly in her lap. "Did Lucy say how long Mrs. Hastings had been alone before she discovered the body?" Mrs. Cartwright blinked. "Well, no. I don't believe so." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "How curious." Mrs. Cartwright frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "You see, my dear Mrs. Cartwright, servants often have very precise routines. Tea times, cleaning schedules, errands, these things rarely change." "Well, of course. So if Lucy expected Mrs. Hastings to be ready for tea at a particular time, she must have known roughly when to go looking for her." Mrs. Cartwright considered this. "Yes. I suppose that's true. Miss Marple smiled faintly. And therefore, she might also know how long Mrs. Hastings had been alone. Mrs. Cartwright looked puzzled. But surely that doesn't matter. The boy was still standing there with the murder weapon. Miss Marple resumed knitting. Yes. That is certainly what makes the situation appear so straightforward. Mrs. Cartwright brightened suddenly. Oh. And I nearly forgot something else. Miss Marple glanced up again. Yes? Apparently Mrs. Hastings changed her will just last month. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-air. Did she indeed? Mrs. Cartwright nodded vigorously. That's what Mr. Pritchard heard from the solicitor's clerk in Marketford. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. And do we know the contents of this new will? No, not exactly. But everyone assumes Oliver is the main beneficiary. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Everyone assumes. Mrs. Cartwright frowned again. Well, naturally. He's her only living relative. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the village postman walked past the garden gate, whistling quietly as he carried his bag of letters. Finally Miss Marple spoke. People often assume that inheritance explains everything. Mrs. Cartwright nodded firmly. Well, in this case, it certainly seems to. Miss Marple smiled politely but did not argue. Instead, she returned her attention to the knitting in her hands. After a moment, Mrs. Cartwright stood. Well, I must get home before luncheon. But really, Miss Marple, it's quite shocking. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Imagine killing one's own aunt. Miss Marple walked her to the door. Human nature, she said thoughtfully, is rarely as simple as we imagine. When Mrs. Cartwright had gone, the cottage became quiet again. Miss Marple returned slowly to her chair by the window. For several minutes she knitted in silence. Then she spoke aloud to no one in particular. A sudden change of will. Her needles clicked. A quarrel overheard by a nervous maid. Another stitch formed. And a boy who was conveniently discovered beside the body. Miss Marple gazed thoughtfully at the garden roses. So very convenient, she murmured. Her mind drifted briefly to a memory from many years earlier. A case in another village. A young man accused of theft. Everyone had believed the evidence obvious. Everyone except Miss Marple. The truth, as it turned out, had been hidden not in the evidence itself, but in the behavior of the people surrounding it. Miss Marple resumed knitting with renewed focus. There is always, she said gently, someone who behaves just a little too correctly. Outside, the peaceful village carried on as usual. But somewhere within Rosewood Manor, hidden among ordinary routines and polite faces, the truth about Margaret Hastings' death waited quietly. And Miss Marple had just begun to notice the first faint signs that something was very wrong.
Why were you near your aunt before she died?
She asked me for tea. When I came back, she was already on the ground.
Chapter 4, The Convenient Suspect. By mid-morning the following day, the village had settled comfortably into the belief that the tragedy at Rosewood Manor was already understood. The police had arrested Oliver Hastings. The evidence appeared solid. And, most reassuring of all to the residents of St. Weatherby-on-Hill, the danger seemed to have come from within the family rather than from some unknown threat wandering their quiet lanes. Inspector Bellamy, however, was a methodical man. Even when a case appeared obvious, procedure required him to examine every detail. Which was why he found himself standing in the drawing room of Rosewood Manor that morning, studying the scene where Margaret Hastings had died. The room itself was impeccably orderly. Margaret Hastings had clearly been a woman who valued discipline. The furniture stood perfectly arranged, the carpet freshly brushed, and the heavy curtains tied neatly beside tall windows that looked out across the garden. The only disruption was the dark stain on the carpet beside the fireplace. And the brass poker resting carefully inside an evidence bag on the nearby table. Inspector Bellamy glanced down at it thoughtfully. A single blow. Clean, direct, and fatal. There had been no sign of struggle. Which suggested something rather important. Margaret Hastings had either trusted the person standing near her, or she had not seen the attack coming. Across the room, Sergeant Collins was speaking quietly with the young maid, Lucy Bennet. Lucy looked pale and anxious, twisting her hands nervously in the front of her apron. Inspector Bellamy approached. "Miss Bennet," he said calmly, "I'd like you to walk me through yesterday afternoon once more." "Yes, sir," Lucy replied quickly. "Start from the beginning." Lucy took a small breath. "Well. Mr. Oliver and Mrs. Hastings were arguing in here around 3 o'clock. Inspector Bellamy nodded. "You heard this clearly?" "Yes, sir. I was dusting the hallway outside." "And what exactly did you hear?" Lucy hesitated. "Mrs. Hastings said Mr. Oliver was ungrateful and that she'd had enough of his behavior." Inspector Bellamy scribbled in his notebook. "And Oliver?" Lucy swallowed. "He said he hated this house, and that she treated him like a prisoner." Inspector Bellamy glanced briefly toward the fireplace. "And the remark about wishing her dead?" Lucy nodded miserably. "Yes, sir. He shouted it just before he ran out into the garden." Sergeant Collins looked up. "And after that?" Lucy continued nervously. "I finished my cleaning upstairs. Then around 4 o'clock I went to ask Mrs. Hastings if she wanted tea." "And that's when you found her?" "Yes, sir." Inspector Bellamy studied her carefully. "Was anyone else in the house?" Lucy shook her head. "No, sir." "And Oliver?" "He was standing right there beside her." Inspector Bellamy closed his notebook slowly. "Thank you, Miss Bennet." Lucy curtsied faintly and hurried from the room as though relieved to escape. Sergeant Collins watched her go. "Poor girl's terrified," he muttered. Inspector Bellamy gave a small shrug. "Murder investigations tend to have that effect." He turned again toward the fireplace. Sergeant Collins folded his arms. "You still think the boy did it?" Inspector Bellamy considered the room once more. "Let's review the facts," he said calmly. He began counting them off on his fingers. First, Oliver Hastings argued violently with the victim shortly before the murder. Second, he threatened her life. Third, he was discovered alone in the room with the body. Fourth, his fingerprints are on the weapon. Sergeant Collins nodded slowly. "Hard to argue with that." Inspector Bellamy slipped his notebook back into his coat. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." Yet something in his tone suggested he was not entirely satisfied. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself walking slowly along the gravel path leading toward Rosewood Manor. She carried a small basket on her arm, which contained a jar of homemade blackberry jam. Miss Marple believed firmly in the usefulness of polite visits. The manor house stood tall and dignified at the edge of the village, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens. But today the place felt strangely quiet. At the front door, Miss Marple was greeted by a thin, middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper expression. "Mrs. Dalton," the woman introduced herself stiffly. "Housekeeper." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "How do you do? I've brought a little something for Miss Bennet. I understand the poor girl has had quite a shock." Mrs. Dalton accepted the basket cautiously. "Yes, well, it has been rather unpleasant." Miss Marple glanced gently past her into the hallway. "I imagine the whole house must feel quite unsettled." Mrs. Dalton pursed her lips. "It was a dreadful business." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "And Mrs. Hastings was always so particular about maintaining order." That remark seemed to soften the housekeeper slightly. "Yes, she was," Mrs. Dalton admitted. Miss Marple paused. "Tell me, Had she seemed worried about anything recently? Mrs. Dalton frowned. Worried? Yes. Changes in routine, perhaps. Unexpected visitors. Financial concerns. The housekeeper hesitated briefly. Well, there was one thing. Miss Marple waited patiently. Mrs. Hastings had been meeting with her solicitor quite frequently these past weeks. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Oh. Yes. Something about revising her will again. Miss Marple tilted her head. Again? Mrs. Dalton nodded. She'd already changed it once last month. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. And she was planning to change it again? Yes. Miss Marple gave a thoughtful little hum. Did Oliver know about this? Mrs. Dalton gave a short laugh. Oh yes. They argued about it constantly. Miss Marple folded her hands. How unfortunate. Mrs. Dalton lowered her voice slightly. If you ask me, that boy had every reason to be angry. Miss Marple smiled politely. Yes, she said gently. Anger does often give people reasons. She paused before adding quietly. But it does not always give them the courage to act. As she walked slowly back down the gravel path, Miss Marple's mind turned over the new information carefully. 2 changes to the will. One already completed. Another planned. And a boy who believed he was about to lose everything. It was, she admitted to herself, a very convincing motive. Perhaps a little too convincing. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl as the afternoon breeze rustled through the hedges. People, she murmured thoughtfully, are rarely so obliging as to commit murder exactly when it benefits them most. Somewhere in the village, a clock chimed the hour. And at that very moment, a new thought quietly settled into Miss Marple's mind. If Oliver Hastings was such a perfect suspect, then someone, somewhere, might have wanted him to be. Chapter 5, The Smallest Detail. The afternoon after Miss Marple's visit to Rosewood Manor passed quietly, though her mind remained far from restful. She sat in her usual place by the window of Rosebank Cottage, knitting steadily while the late sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. To anyone passing along the road, she appeared as she always did, an elderly lady enjoying a peaceful afternoon with her wool and needles. But Miss Marple was thinking very carefully about wills. People, she reflected, behaved in rather predictable ways when money was involved. In fact, money had a remarkable ability to reveal a person's true nature. And the matter of Margaret Hastings changing her will twice in such a short time was most curious. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sound of the village postman's footsteps approaching the garden gate. Moments later, Mr. Fletcher knocked cheerfully on the door. Afternoon, Miss Marple. Good afternoon, Mr. Fletcher, she replied pleasantly. He handed her a small bundle of letters, but instead of leaving immediately, as postmen generally preferred to do, he lingered slightly. Quite a business up at Rosewood Manor, he said gravely. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Mr. Fletcher lowered his voice in the confidential manner that villagers often adopted when discussing unpleasant matters. Inspector Bellamy's been asking questions all morning. Indeed? Went straight to the solicitor's office in Market Ford after lunch. Miss Marple's knitting slowed. The solicitor? Yes. Something about Mrs. Hastings' will. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How interesting. Mr. Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. Funny thing, though. Miss Marple looked up. What is? Well, he said, scratching his chin, Mrs. Hastings only sent a letter to that solicitor 2 days ago. Miss Marple set her knitting carefully in her lap. Did she? Yes. Registered post. I delivered it myself. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened just slightly. And that was 2 days before her death? That's right. Mr. Fletcher shrugged. Must have been about the will again, I suppose. Miss Marple nodded politely, though her mind had already begun moving rapidly through several possibilities. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. That is very helpful." He tipped his cap. "Terrible business, though. Poor boy doesn't stand much chance if you ask me." When the door closed behind him, Miss Marple remained very still. Then she picked up her knitting again, but this time her needles did not move. 2 days before the murder. A letter to the solicitor. And according to the housekeeper, Mrs. Hastings had been planning to change her will again. Miss Marple spoke softly to herself. One does not usually write such letters unless the decision is already made. The next morning, Inspector Bellamy arrived at Rosebank Cottage unannounced. Miss Marple greeted him warmly. "Inspector, how nice to see you again. I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said politely. "Not at all. Please come in." He sat at the small table while Miss Marple poured tea with practiced care. "I've just come from Market Ford," he explained. "The solicitor's office?" Inspector Bellamy looked slightly surprised. "Yes, actually." Miss Marple smiled gently. "The village postman mentioned you had been asking questions there." Inspector Bellamy accepted his tea. "Well, I did learn something rather interesting." Miss Marple waited patiently. "The will Mrs. Hastings changed last month leaves everything to Oliver." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable." "Yes," the inspector agreed. "But the letter she sent 2 days ago instructed the solicitor to prepare a new will." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "And do we know what the new will said?" Inspector Bellamy shook his head. "The document was never finalized. But according to the solicitor." He paused. "Mrs. Hastings intended to remove Oliver entirely." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew thoughtful. "I see." Inspector Bellamy leaned forward slightly. "If Oliver knew that." Miss Marple finished the thought calmly. "He would have lost everything." "Exactly." The inspector sipped his tea. "It strengthens the motive considerably." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Yes, it certainly does." Inspector Bellamy watched her carefully. "You don't seem entirely convinced." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I find it very convincing, Inspector." He raised an eyebrow. "But?" Miss Marple reached for her knitting again. "But there is one very small detail that troubles me." Inspector Bellamy leaned back. "I'm listening." Miss Marple began knitting slowly. "You see, when people plan something as serious as changing their will, they usually mention it." "Mention it?" "Yes. To their solicitor, their servants, their relatives." Inspector Bellamy frowned. "Well, Mrs. Hastings clearly mentioned it to her solicitor." "Yes." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "But according to Mrs. Dalton, Oliver and his aunt were arguing constantly about the will." "That's right." Miss Marple looked up gently. "Which suggests Oliver already knew he might be removed from it." Inspector Bellamy nodded. "Correct." Miss Marple tilted her head. "So if Oliver believed he was about to lose everything." She paused briefly. "Why wait until the very afternoon his aunt sent the letter to the solicitor?" Inspector Bellamy blinked. "That is, rather specific timing." "Quite." Miss Marple resumed knitting calmly. "Almost as though someone wished the murder to occur at precisely the moment it would make Oliver appear most guilty." Inspector Bellamy stared at her. "That's a serious suggestion." Miss Marple smiled politely. "Oh dear, Inspector, I'm not suggesting anything." She added softly. "I'm merely observing human nature." Inspector Bellamy stood slowly, deep in thought. "You believe someone knew about the letter?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead she said, "People are often careless with their conversations, especially in large houses with servants." The inspector nodded slowly. Meaning someone else might have overheard. Yes. Miss Marple placed another stitch. And if that person wished to remove Mrs. Hastings? Her voice remained gentle. What better way than to ensure the blame fell neatly upon the young man everyone already suspected? Inspector Bellamy was silent for several seconds. Then he said quietly, "I think I need to speak to the staff again." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "That seems very sensible." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting with quiet satisfaction. Because sometimes the smallest details— a letter, a conversation overheard, a change of timing— could unravel an entire mystery. And Miss Marple had just found the first thread that did not belong.
The situation is serious. We must be prepared.
How bad is it?
We must remain calm.
What should we do?
Follow the plan.
Chapter 6, Secrets Beneath Polite Smiles. Inspector Bellamy returned to Rosewood Manor later that same afternoon with a noticeably different expression from the one he had worn during his previous visit. Where earlier he had seemed confident in the neat simplicity of the case, now there was something more cautious in his manner, something more deliberate. Sergeant Collins noticed it immediately as they walked up the gravel drive together. "Something on your mind, sir?" Collins asked. Inspector Bellamy adjusted his coat slightly. "Possibly," he replied. "I'd like to speak to the household staff again." Collins raised an eyebrow. "About the will?" "Among other things." Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, greeted them in the same brisk manner as before, though she seemed somewhat less composed this time. "The police again," she said stiffly. "I'm afraid so," Inspector Bellamy replied politely. "We have a few additional questions." Mrs. Dalton gave a tight nod. "Very well." They were shown into the morning room, a smaller sitting area overlooking the rose garden. Lucy Bennet, the young maid, arrived shortly afterward, looking even more nervous than during the previous questioning. Inspector Bellamy sat across from her calmly. "Miss Bennet, I'd like to revisit something you mentioned yesterday." Lucy clasped her hands together anxiously. "Yes, sir." "The argument between Oliver and his aunt." "Yes, sir." Inspector Bellamy spoke gently. "You said they argued frequently about Mrs. Hastings' will." Lucy nodded quickly. "Oh yes, sir. It was always the same quarrel." Sergeant Collins glanced up. "The boy wanted the money?" Lucy hesitated. "Well, not exactly." Inspector Bellamy leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Lucy bit her lip. "Mr. Oliver didn't really care about the money. He just wanted to leave." "Leave?" "Yes, sir. He hated living here." Inspector Bellamy frowned thoughtfully. "And Mrs. Hastings refused to let him go?" Lucy nodded again. "She said he was too young to make his own decisions." Sergeant Collins folded his arms. "That hardly sounds like a motive for murder." Inspector Bellamy's eyes remained on Lucy. "You mentioned they argued constantly about the will. Who usually started these arguments?" Lucy hesitated again, glancing nervously toward the door. "Well, sometimes Mrs. Hastings." "And sometimes?" Lucy lowered her voice. "Sometimes Mrs. Dalton." The room grew slightly still. Inspector Bellamy looked toward the housekeeper, who stood stiffly near the window. "Mrs. Dalton?" The housekeeper's expression hardened. "I merely reminded Mrs. Hastings of practical matters." Inspector Bellamy's voice remained calm. "Practical matters concerning the will?" "Yes." She lifted her chin slightly. "I have served this household for nearly 20 years. I only wished to ensure Mrs. Hastings made wise decisions." Miss Marple's quiet remark from earlier echoed faintly in the inspector's mind. People often behave just a little too correctly. Inspector Bellamy returned his attention to Lucy. "You also mentioned Mrs. Hastings' plan to change the will again." "Yes, sir." Did anyone else know about that? Lucy hesitated. Well, Mrs. Dalton knew. Inspector Bellamy glanced again toward the housekeeper. Mrs. Dalton spoke quickly. I only knew because Mrs. Hastings discussed it in my presence. Discussed what exactly? That she intended to leave the estate to a charitable trust instead of Oliver. Sergeant Collins whistled softly. That would certainly upset the boy. Inspector Bellamy remained quiet. Lucy spoke timidly. But Mr. Oliver didn't know that part. Inspector Bellamy turned back to her. You're certain? Yes, sir. What makes you say that? Lucy looked confused. Because he still thought the argument was about sending him away to school. Inspector Bellamy's eyebrows rose slightly. You're saying Oliver didn't know he was being removed from the will? Lucy shook her head. No, sir. The inspector leaned back slowly. That's very interesting. Mrs. Dalton spoke sharply. He must have suspected something. Perhaps, Inspector Bellamy said calmly. But suspicion and certainty are very different things. He closed his notebook and stood. That will be all for now. As the two officers walked back down the gravel drive, Sergeant Collins spoke quietly. Well, that complicates things. Inspector Bellamy nodded. If Oliver didn't know about the new will, the timing becomes rather less convincing. Collins glanced toward the house. You think someone else knew? Inspector Bellamy did not answer immediately. Instead, his thoughts drifted briefly back to Rosebank Cottage. To Miss Marple's calm voice. Someone might have overheard. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her garden enjoying the last light of sunset when a visitor approached the gate. It was Dr. Hayward, the village physician. Good evening, Miss Marple. Good evening, Doctor. Won't you sit down? He accepted the chair beside her with a tired sigh. Terrible business at the manor. Yes, Miss Marple agreed softly. Dr. Hayward hesitated before continuing. I performed the examination this morning. Miss Marple looked at him thoughtfully. And? The time of death is somewhat earlier than expected. Miss Marple's knitting paused. How much earlier? Closer to 3:30. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened slightly. That would place it only minutes after Oliver left the house. Yes, said the doctor. He added carefully. But according to the maid, Oliver had already gone out to the far end of the garden by then. Miss Marple leaned back slowly. Which means? Dr. Hayward nodded. Yes. For the first time since the investigation began, there was now a clear and troubling possibility. Oliver Hastings might not have been in the room when Margaret Hastings died. Miss Marple resumed knitting quietly. Human nature, she said thoughtfully, has a remarkable way of revealing itself through the smallest inconsistencies. Dr. Hayward studied her curiously. You think the boy is innocent? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, innocence is such a complicated thing, Doctor. She placed another stitch. But I do believe. Her voice remained calm. That someone in this village is behaving far too carefully. And somewhere in the quiet house of Rosewood Manor, behind polite smiles and orderly routines, the person responsible for Margaret Hastings' death continued to watch the investigation unfold, confident that suspicion rested safely on the wrong shoulders. Chapter 7, A Twist in the Garden. The next morning, the village awoke to another layer of unease. Even the familiar scent of baking bread from the corner shop seemed tainted by the recent events. Residents moved cautiously along the lanes, speaking in hushed tones and casting sideways glances at Rosewood Manor, which loomed quietly at the edge of town. Miss Marple, however, began her day as usual, tending her small garden at Rosebank Cottage. Her hands, careful and steady, pruned the lavender and adjusted the borders of her daisies. Yet her mind was far from the roses. She was thinking about the small inconsistencies that had been quietly accumulating. A letter to the solicitor, the timing of the argument, and the observation from Dr. Hayward about the true time of death, all of it suggested a story different from what the villagers and even the police believed. A brisk knock on the gate pulled her from her thoughts. It was Mrs. Cartwright, looking unusually flustered. "Miss Marple, you must come quickly," she said, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Something's happened in the garden." Miss Marple's knitting was left aside as she followed her friend down the familiar path. Outside the manor gates, a small crowd had gathered. Curious villagers whispered nervously, pointing toward the far side of the estate where the flowers bordered a gravel walkway. "It's Mr. Pritchard!" Mrs. Cartwright exclaimed, voice trembling. "He found something while walking near the hedgerow." Miss Marple pushed forward, slipping past a cluster of onlookers with polite nods. Inspector Bellamy and Sergeant Collins were already there, crouched beside the edge of a neatly trimmed rose bed. Miss Marple observed silently. Near the base of a tall yew tree lay a small, crumpled envelope, half buried in the gravel. She knelt slightly to examine it without touching it, noting the crisp handwriting that peeked from the opening. Inspector Bellamy glanced up at her. "Looks like a letter, Miss Marple. No indication of who put it here. Could be significant." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "It appears carefully placed," she said softly. "Not dropped in haste. Whoever did this wanted it to be found, or at least to be seen." Sergeant Collins stood uneasily. Could it be evidence? Miss Marple considered the angle of the envelope, the position of the gravel, and the shadows cast by the morning sun. "Possibly," she said. "Or it could be a distraction. One must always ask, why here, and why now?" Inspector Bellamy gingerly picked up the letter with gloved hands and handed it to her. Miss Marple read the contents silently. Her eyes flicked quickly across each line, noting the careful phrasing. It was from Margaret Hastings herself, written 2 days before her death. The letter instructed the solicitor to finalize a change to the will, but it also contained a peculiar note in the margin: "Trust no one entirely, not even the familiar." Her knitting-like attention to patterns and nuance picked up the subtle tension in the wording. The note was deliberate, not an idle scribble. It suggested suspicion, and perhaps fear. Sergeant Collins whistled softly. "Sounds like Mrs. Hastings knew something, or someone, was up to no good." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting toward the house. "Indeed. And it was a warning, clearly meant for eyes only she trusted, or thought she could trust." Inspector Bellamy frowned. But who would have intercepted this letter, or known about it? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She rose and walked slowly toward the yew tree, inspecting the gravel beneath it. A small disturbance in the otherwise uniform pattern of the stones caught her eye, a faint drag mark. Something had been moved. Her mind worked quietly, linking each observation. If Oliver Hastings had left the house shortly before the murder, and if he had not known about the new will, then the person who orchestrated the crime had to be someone who knew both the timing and the family's routines intimately. She turned to Inspector Bellamy. Someone within the household. Someone accustomed to moving unseen, to observing without being noticed. And someone clever enough to ensure the blame appeared obvious. Bellamy exchanged a glance with Collins. "You think it's not Oliver?" Miss Marple shook her head ever so slightly. "He is conveniently placed, yes. But a truly guilty party would know exactly how to manipulate appearances." Mrs. Cartwright, still standing near the edge of the garden, looked confused. "But who could that be, Miss Marple? Everyone seemed so proper." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, proper behavior is often the easiest mask to wear." She crouched again, examining the drag marks with meticulous care. "This letter was placed here to be discovered. And yet," she added softly, "the placement is too obvious. The criminal wants it found, but not too quickly. A subtle psychological game. Inspector Bellamy's brow furrowed. So the letter is a clue and a trap at the same time. Precisely, Miss Marple said, standing straight and smoothing her shawl. And it suggests that the real murderer is watching the investigation unfold, confident that the evidence points elsewhere. She paused, letting the words sink in. Oliver Hastings, she continued quietly, is at the center because everyone expects him to be. But the true culprit is someone who understands human behavior far too well, someone who can disguise their actions under the polite routines of this house. Sergeant Collins muttered, sounds like a master manipulator. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. And master manipulators often leave the smallest mistakes, tiny inconsistencies that reveal more than they intend. It is in those details that the truth waits. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the yews, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the envelope one last time. The faint drag marks, the deliberate placement, and the cryptic note in the margin, all of it pointed toward a hidden hand guiding the scene. The quiet village of St. Wetherby-on-Hill seemed to hold its breath. And in the manor house, behind polite smiles and well-ordered rooms, the real murderer watched carefully, certain that suspicion rested firmly upon the wrong shoulders. Miss Marple, knitting calmly by the roses, had begun to follow the first trail of that hidden hand. And the threads were leading somewhere unexpected.
It's getting chilly, dear. I'll pour you some tea, that would be lovely.
Chapter 8, Miss Marple's Subtle Test. The following morning, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. The village was still quiet, with only the faint crowing of a distant rooster and the soft rustle of leaves in the hedgerows. She prepared her breakfast with deliberate calm, but her mind had already turned toward Rosewood Manor. The small inconsistencies she had noticed, the timing of Oliver's departure, the note in the letter, the drag marks in the garden, formed a delicate web that only careful observation could unravel. By mid-morning, she set off along the familiar gravel path toward the manor, carrying a small basket of scones. She had no intention of simply gossiping with the staff or witnesses, her goal was far subtler. Today, she would watch, listen, and test. The front door opened before she could knock. It was Mrs. Dalton, the housekeeper, who greeted her with the same crisp politeness as before, though now her smile was slightly strained. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said. "How kind of you to bring something for the staff." Miss Marple returned the smile and stepped inside. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalton. I thought a little refreshment might do them good. Such a stressful time for everyone, of course." The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Miss Marple noticed the careful order of the furniture, the precise arrangement of objects on the mantelpiece, and the way the servants moved with an almost exaggerated care, as if each step were measured to avoid suspicion. She set the basket down on a side table and began distributing scones to Lucy Bennet and the maid who had arrived later. Then, turning to Mrs. Dalton, she said gently, "Do you mind if I look over the garden briefly? I've always found roses so restorative in the morning." Mrs. Dalton hesitated. "Of course, Miss Marple." Miss Marple stepped outside, her eyes scanning the gravel paths, the flower beds, and the yew trees. Her fingers rested lightly on her knitting, though she did not begin. Instead, she observed. After a few moments, she noticed movement from the house. Mrs. Dalton was speaking with another servant in low tones, but Miss Marple could see the subtle gestures, a finger pointing toward the garden, a slight shake of the head, and then the housekeeper quickly turned back toward the manor, ensuring no one outside saw too much. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. There was calculation in that movement, a desire to communicate secretly without revealing anything to outsiders. Returning to the veranda, she approached Mrs. Dalton casually. "I noticed you speaking with the other maid earlier," she said gently. "I hope there is nothing troubling them." Mrs. Dalton's lips pressed tightly together. "They are just concerned about the investigation, Miss Marple. Nothing more." Miss Marple smiled softly, pretending to consider her knitting. "Of course. Yet it is remarkable how small details can reveal far more than people intend, don't you think? Mrs. Dalton stiffened slightly but did not respond. Later, in the drawing room, Miss Marple found herself near the window, observing the movements of the house with an unassuming air. She spoke quietly to herself, as though thinking aloud. The placement of the letter, the time of death, and the arguments overheard, all pieces of a puzzle. As if responding to her words, Mrs. Dalton appeared, ostensibly to adjust a cushion on the settee. Miss Marple tilted her head. "I do wonder, Mrs. Dalton, do you find it difficult to serve in a household where such tension exists?" Mrs. Dalton paused, hands stilling on the cushion. "Tension is unavoidable, Miss Marple." Miss Marple continued in the same gentle tone, "Indeed. And yet, it is often the very tension that reveals the truth of human character. People reveal themselves in subtle ways, gestures, hesitations, and expressions that they cannot entirely control." Mrs. Dalton's eyes flicked toward her, a micro-expression that lasted barely a second, but Miss Marple noticed it. She pressed on, her voice soft and inviting. "For instance, a small act, perhaps placing a letter where it might be discovered, could mean something entirely different depending on the intent. One could place it to warn, or one could place it to mislead." Mrs. Dalton's hands tightened slightly. I do not understand," she said, her voice carefully measured. Miss Marple's smile remained polite. "Oh, I am sure you do, Mrs. Dalton. One merely needs to pay attention." The housekeeper's eyes flicked toward the door, then back at Miss Marple. She said nothing further, though her posture had shifted, subtly defensive, almost unconsciously. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly. The hesitation, the glance, the small tension in the shoulders, all pointed to someone unaccustomed to being truly observed. And she had been watching carefully. Later that afternoon, while the sun slanted low over the manor, Miss Marple approached Inspector Bellamy as he surveyed the rose garden. "Inspector, may I ask you something?" she said in her gentle, unobtrusive way. "Of course, Miss Marple," he replied. "Have you noticed any unusual behavior among the household staff?" she asked softly. Bellamy frowned. "Unusual? You mean beyond nervousness?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Nervousness is natural in a household suddenly implicated in a murder. I mean calculated behavior, people who act as though they are guiding the investigation in some subtle way." The inspector looked thoughtful. "You mean, misdirection?" "Possibly," she said, "or perhaps the concealment of a secret that only a careful observer can detect. Human nature, Inspector, often leaves faint traces if one knows where to look." Bellamy's eyes narrowed. "And you believe someone in this house is doing exactly that?" Miss Marple's gaze swept the garden. "Yes. And I intend to find out." A few moments of silence passed. Then she added quietly, almost to herself, "The smallest detail, the slightest hesitation, these will reveal far more than any confession ever could." As the shadows grew long across the gravel paths, Miss Marple resumed her knitting on a bench near the roses, her calm demeanor masking the careful psychological game she had already begun. Somewhere inside Rosewood Manor, the real murderer was still confident, believing the investigation led elsewhere. But Miss Marple had set her trap, not with force, not with accusation, but with patient observation, subtle conversation, and an unerring attention to the behavior that betrayed the truth. And soon, she knew, the smallest detail would be enough to make it all clear.
"So, did anyone see where the letter was placed?" I don't know."
Chapter 9, The Reveal. The evening at Rosebank Cottage was unusually still. The last golden rays of the sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across Miss Marple's neatly arranged knitting basket. The village, which had spent the week in a restless hum of gossip and speculation, had settled into a quiet apprehension. Every resident believed the case was nearly solved, and yet the final truth remained just out of reach. Miss Marple, however, felt closer than ever. She had been observing, listening, and testing everyone connected to Rosewood Manor. Each conversation, each nervous glance, every hesitation, small as it seemed, had been catalogued in her mind like careful stitches in her knitting. And tonight, the threads had woven together into a pattern she could no longer ignore. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Bellamy, hat in hand, with the faint tension of a man on the cusp of discovery. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside. "We've had the entire household assembled at the manor. I think it's time we bring this to a conclusion." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, Inspector. It is often best to let people speak, and observe, before drawing the final line." They arrived at Rosewood Manor as the last light of day faded, leaving the house in soft shadow. Inside, the drawing room was arranged carefully. The staff, servants, and housekeeper all stood in their familiar positions, eyes wary and voices subdued. Oliver Hastings, pale but composed, was seated near the window, hands folded in his lap. Miss Marple stood near the fireplace, knitting needles tucked neatly into her basket, her calm presence commanding attention without demanding it. "I understand this has been a trying week for everyone," she began, her voice soft but steady. "We are gathered not to accuse, but to understand the events that led to Margaret Hastings' untimely death." All eyes were upon her, though none suspected the quiet depth of her observation. "Inspector Bellamy," she continued, "you have done a commendable job with the physical evidence and timelines. Yet the truth, as I have discovered, does not lie solely in the objects or the letters. It lies in the behavior of those present." Mrs. Dalton's posture stiffened imperceptibly. Miss Marple allowed a gentle pause. The housekeeper's fingers twisted the hem of her apron, a small, telling gesture. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Margaret Hastings changed her will twice in recent weeks. The first time, Oliver was the sole beneficiary. The second, she intended to remove him entirely, a decision known to very few." A murmur ran through the assembled group. "Now," Miss Marple said, lifting her gaze to meet Mrs. Dalton's, "the letter written 2 days before her death instructed the solicitor to finalize this change. That letter, however, was discovered placed carefully in the garden, an act that could not have been accidental." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. "Who placed it there?" someone asked nervously. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "Ah, that is what we are here to determine. Consider, if you will, the timing of Mrs. Hastings' death. According to Dr. Hayward, she was killed around 3:30, mere minutes after Oliver left the room. And yet, the boy could not have committed the act if the time of death is accurate." Oliver's eyes widened slightly, but he remained still. "Observe, my friends," Miss Marple continued, "the small but telling inconsistencies. The drag marks in the garden suggest deliberate placement. The note in the letter indicates awareness of hidden threats. And the behaviors I have seen among you, subtle gestures, glances, and hesitations, speak far louder than words ever could." All eyes shifted toward Mrs. Dalton, whose composure was cracking under the quiet weight of Miss Marple's observation. "Mrs. Dalton," Miss Marple said softly, "you have served this household for many years. You know the routines, the habits, and the vulnerabilities. You were present when the second will was discussed. You understood the consequences for Oliver, and you acted upon that knowledge." The housekeeper's hands trembled slightly. Her voice was tight. I only wished to advise Mrs. Hastings. I never." Miss Marple held up a hand, her voice gentle yet firm. "You may have intended merely to guide, yet guidance became opportunity. You knew Oliver was the obvious suspect, that timing, positioning, and previous arguments would cast suspicion upon him. And you used it." The room grew silent, the tension almost unbearable. "You killed Margaret Hastings," Miss Marple said softly. "Not in anger, but with calculation. You ensured Oliver appeared guilty, confident that the village and the law would see what you wished them to see." Mrs. Dalton's eyes filled with tears. She glanced helplessly at Oliver, who now understood completely that his innocence had been exploited. Inspector Bellamy stepped forward, expression grave but precise. "Mrs. Dalton, you are under arrest for the murder of Margaret Hastings. You have the right to remain silent." Mrs. Dalton did not resist. Her composure dissolved entirely as the weight of her actions finally overtook her. Miss Marple, ever calm, gathered her knitting. She turned to Oliver, whose relief was tempered by the week's ordeal. "You see, young man," she said quietly, "sometimes innocence is not enough. One must also survive the clever misdirection of others." Oliver's eyes glistened. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I never knew anyone could be so observant." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Observant, yes. But also patient. It is often the small, easily overlooked details that reveal the most significant truths." The household remained still as the gravity of the revelation settled. The polite facade had cracked, and the hidden web of secrets lay exposed. Miss Marple glanced once more around the room. "Now," she said softly, "we can finally allow justice to follow its course. And perhaps, in time, the village may find peace again." Outside, the last rays of sunlight faded behind the hills of St. Wetherby-on-Hill. Inside Rosewood Manor, the air felt lighter, though an unmistakable shadow of unease lingered, a reminder that even in the quietest villages, human nature was rarely simple. Miss Marple gathered her shawl, her knitting, and her calm, unassuming presence, leaving behind a scene where truth had quietly, decisively, outmaneuvered deception. Chapter 10, The Quiet Aftermath. The village of St. Wetherby-on-Hill had returned to its usual rhythm, though a subtle tension lingered in the air. Shopkeepers spoke in quieter tones, children played more cautiously in the streets, and the lingering shadow of Rosewood Manor's tragedy was visible in every polite nod and sideways glance. Yet life, inexorably, moved forward. Miss Marple sat by her window at Rosebank Cottage, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. She had spent the morning reflecting on the events that had unfolded, on the human behaviors that had led to Mrs. Dalton's unmasking, and on the extraordinary patience it had required to let truth reveal itself. Her calm demeanor concealed a mind that had been tirelessly active, stitching together minute inconsistencies into the fabric of reality. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. It was Oliver Hastings, looking slightly more confident than the last time she had seen him, though still carrying the weariness of the ordeal he had endured. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wanted to thank you." Miss Marple smiled warmly, cutting him off gently. "You need not thank me, Oliver. You did nothing wrong. Sometimes, the world conspires to make the innocent appear guilty, and it takes only a little patience, and observation, to see the truth." He hesitated, then asked cautiously, "Do you think the village will forget?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Forget? Perhaps not. But they will understand, in time, that appearances are not always what they seem. And that is a lesson worth remembering." Oliver nodded slowly, a faint smile appearing for the first time in days. "I suppose that's true. I feel lucky to have been guided by someone who saw beyond what everyone else assumed." Outside, the quiet hum of village life continued. The local postman delivered letters without incident, the baker set fresh loaves on display, and the faint sound of a carriage rattling along the cobbled streets reminded Miss Marple that ordinary life always returned, even after extraordinary events. Inside Rosewood Manor, the atmosphere had changed decisively. The staff moved with a subdued energy, aware that the careful facade of polite order had been exposed. The arrest of Mrs. Dalton had shaken the household, but it had also brought clarity. Justice had been served without sensationalism or spectacle, simply through the patient unraveling of human nature. Miss Marple sipped her tea, contemplating the delicate balance between intention and action. Mrs. Dalton had believed her careful maneuvers and subtle deceptions would keep suspicion focused elsewhere. Yet it was precisely those small, controlled actions, an over-attentive gesture here, an unnecessary glance there, that had revealed her true culpability. It was, as always, human behavior that had solved the puzzle. The smallest tell, the quietest hesitation, the subtle misplacement of a letter, these were the threads Miss Marple had followed, one by one, until the truth emerged in full clarity. The village itself began to return to a gentler pace. Children laughed more freely, shopkeepers resumed their friendly chatter, and neighbors ventured into one another's homes without the wary caution that had marked the week. Yet beneath the surface, Miss Marple knew the lessons of Rosewood Manor would linger. People had witnessed how ordinary routines and polite facades could conceal extraordinary secrets, and how easily assumptions could mislead. Later that afternoon, as the sun slanted low across the fields, Miss Marple walked slowly through her garden, pausing to inspect the roses she had tended with care. She thought of Oliver Hastings, of Mrs. Dalton, and of the quiet but persistent truth that had guided her to the solution. Human nature, she reflected, was a complex tapestry. Beneath the civility and routine lay ambition, fear, envy, and sometimes, courage. And it was only through careful attention, patience, and understanding that these hidden patterns could be discerned. Returning to her chair, Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, allowing her fingers to move automatically while her mind replayed the week's events. She thought of the villagers, of the intricate web of relationships at Rosewood Manor, and of the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice served without fanfare. A soft breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. The day had ended, the mystery resolved, and the village, though forever marked by its brief brush with tragedy, would continue, slowly and gently, to rebuild its ordinary rhythms. Miss Marple, calm and unassuming, returned to her knitting. In the quiet of Rosebank Cottage, she allowed herself a small smile. The case was concluded, the truth revealed, and once again, the unassuming detective had reminded everyone that the most profound discoveries often emerge from the smallest, most subtle observations. And in that quiet, orderly world, life went on, leaving only a gentle reminder that beneath the surface of ordinary existence, the truth always waits for those who are patient enough, and perceptive enough, to see it.